Financial markets close at 5 p.m. Night markets open at 6. My name is Gerrit Schmidt. I'm the Deputy CEO at Schmidt Family Office and Head of Family Governance Research at SFO Research. This evening, I'm continuing a conversation that started at the FBI conference this week actually, with my colleague Ajanta Mayku, Head of Family Office at Absa Private Wealth, and also a fellow family governance thinker. So Ajanta, welcome to Night Markets.
Thank you, Gerrit. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Ajanta, I don't see this as a new conversation. In fact, I see this as a conversation that started 8 years ago, has been continuing all the way through. But there was a particular milestone for us this week because for the first time publicly, really, the two of us, along with our esteemed panel, were able to really turn the volume button up all the way for family governance at the FBI conference. You'd agree that it was a different kind of conversation, right?
So, Gerrit, what was really interesting for me is we, in the room, were very, very experienced financial planners, investment managers, wealth managers, etc., right? Mm-hmm. So we've always spoken about the conventional stuff, but this is literally market leading. And it's stuff that I think is not mainstream just as yet, but we're breaking through in that regard.
I kind of see what you did there. You did the whole, we didn't speak about conventional stuff at the convention, right?
Right.
Sorry. Ajanta, but I think the point for me really was our audience was not there just for CPD points. That's not the point. They were there because I think there was a real interest in, I don't want to say this new topic because it's not a new thing, but I think it's newly realized that family governance is a means to add more value for clients. Getting to second base with this, or the practical potential for this with clients, is a way to differentiate as a financial planner or wealth manager, sort of beyond fees and promise. And you must say the level of engagement in the room was different.
It was. And you touch on the concept of differentiation. So that's one aspect commercially. But when you cut to the heart of it and consider the impact of this kind of work and this type of conversation, you're really getting to the heart of a family, the essence of a family.
What is, if we're looking at value creation in financial services, and specifically from an advisor perspective, what is more relatable to connect with than family values? By extension of that, if there's this new appreciation for understanding family dynamics, this already lends itself towards more of a consulting relationship with a family, not so? And something that came up quite strongly in your narrative at the conference that I really enjoyed was, so often we just sort of jump into solutioning, right? But simply put, there's no template solution to families. It only lends itself towards deep learning and understanding and the longer road that we ultimately seek to walk with families.
Exactly. So when we look at this process, the goal here is not, as I've said, the constitution. It's not an investment committee. It's not a tick box approach. It's not the will or the trust deed.
Yeah.
It is the magic happens in that process, in aligning with family, with the non-family members. And I mean, we also spoke about what does success look like, right?
Exactly.
And that can mean different things. So, and you can have individuals within a family defining success differently.
Yes.
Now, bring this together and you've got all of these divergent interests, and it's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And Ajanta, so I asked a question to the audience, and I think it's sort of key for us to pick up just on that to align your point. When we talk about family and we talk about business, are we talking about the family business or are we a business family? By extension, is it all about the family enterprise or are we an enterprising family? And that already widens the potential for definition all the way up. Because what you're getting at is that I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your level of involvement in this specific enterprise should not be limited to the very business function of that enterprise. There's a potential for you to be meaningfully engaged in other ways, but that can only really be realized if the family culture is conducive to that kind of support, that kind of involvement.
So this is the nub of it for me, right? And as advisors, we've been working for years and years with our basic principles, our frameworks of estate planning, wealth protection. These are all words and ideologies that we're familiar with, right? But the stats are clear in terms of wealth moving from one generation to the next. Only 70% of that is successful, right? But we've got all of this literature, the frameworks in place, but why hasn't it worked? Why is that failure rate so high, right? And this is why we're talking right now, because this is the game changer in terms of creating a successful transfer of wealth from one generation to the next.
Yeah, and Ajanta, I love that we're bringing data to this. We spoke quite a bit this week, and much of the content at the conference circled around the greatest wealth transfer in history, which is already in motion. It's not something that's happening, or going to happen. It's something that's happening. It's already in motion. But what does that look like, and how does that impact financial services? Forbes quantifies this as a intergenerational shift of upwards of $84 trillion. Now that is staggering.
Yeah,
that is significant. But for me, the equally significant bit of data is that 70% of wealth transfers are projected to fail.
Right.
So this doesn't mean that 100% of families are getting it wrong. It just means that statistically, wealth transfers have their challenges. So the question I must ask you is, and which I think is to your earlier point also, is if we as financial services professionals understand the challenge and the opportunity, is this not the time right now to be thinking about how to get to practical next steps with family governance?
Gerrit, it is absolutely the time. So firstly, introducing the concept, understanding the power of the process, understanding why we need to do it, why it needs to be done, as well as the benefit, right? And the research is there. We know why we're doing it, but it's important that we take that out to our clients and create that value, right? So that alignment through generations. And, we can cover a couple of examples as we proceed in this conversation. But just leveraging from examples through practice through the years. And I've seen how, for instance, when done well, it's a recipe for success. But I've also seen, when the planning's not in place and that alignment has not taken place, families suffer, businesses suffer, employees suffer. So that ripple effect is a lot more far-reaching than just being contained within a family unit.
I love that you said family unit, because why is the family unit not the very unit of analysis? So often we are guided by the NAV, and we think that year on year that equals progress. It so often does not. What we are actually in service of, and it might sound very abstract to frame it this way, is we are ultimately in service of family continuity.
Yes.
When financial capital is merely an enabler. And that is quite a bold reframing, but I think it's a necessary one.
So what does success look like, right? Define success of a business, of a family, and it depends who you ask. So, for instance, success of a business could mean the bottom line, right? But at what risk? So does that mean sacrificing the harmony of a family? Does profit cancel whether there's a harmonious relationship between cousins, brothers? And ideally, by going through this process, you'd want to achieve both.
Exactly. And when you talk about the bottom line, we can have a double bottom line, triple bottom line conversation from a purpose and sustainability perspective. But that conversation needs to be extended to the underlying value of family,
right?
Which for me ultimately comes down to its ability to flourish. What is the point of all of this? The point is not limited to financial growth. It's also about personal growth. Think about legacy. Think about your own legacy. From your own personal legacy perspective, as head of family office, clearly you have identified this as part of your story. You work within an organization where stories matter. I mean, it's your very tagline, right? Your story matters. But for you, I know this is also very personal because, as I understand it, you see this as a necessary extension or point of differentiation for the value proposition.
So for decades and centuries, we've been doing the traditional planning at various levels, right? And at this point, my vision for business and for the family office really is to take it one step further. So we can leverage the full capability of the bank and whatever that means. And of course, we want to grow and protect wealth for our clients. But we need to show up differently and we need to do it differently because the things that have been successful in the past aren't necessarily going to work in this ever dynamic environment, right? So this process is integral to that, creating awareness and also entrenching ourselves with families to create that understanding. So I've got that responsibility to not just tick all of the boxes of our value proposition and product lines, but to take it a step further to protect and also just equip families to protect that wealth. But most importantly, you use the term flourish. And I like also to reference the term of family harmony, right? And I also just want to pause on that concept for just a moment, because I think this has come up in conversation before with us in terms of you have different competing interests within a family, right?
Yes.
And this is also something, and, you know, to the viewers that may be listening, this is also something where it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix everything. And everybody's not at the end of this process going to be sitting in the room singing Kumbaya. However, it surfaces really pertinent points for discussion and alignment.
It should be, the family should be conducive to diversity. It should be conducive to developing new interests. Ultimately, the family is stronger for that. And as part of what you're saying, what I'm hearing really is that it comes back to culture again. And as an advisor, if you are involved on a strategic level because you understand the cultural significance and uniqueness thereof, which differs from each family, that equals a kind of stickiness, which is very, very rare to find.
That's also potentially a contentious point when you talk of culture, because culture, and we look at this from an organizational perspective as well, right? How do you define culture? How do you build it? How do you change it? From a family perspective, arguably, is this not something that is organic, right? So enter someone talking to a family about family governance, and we understand the principles of culture. A consideration is, how does one influence culture, right?
So I want to challenge you on that. And it's not, I don't think it's talking to a family. Here I come with my rule book, and this is what this is what our culture should look like. I think it's developing the capacity to talk with the family, because what this really is playing a meaningful role on that side of the table. And what that means is understanding that you want a 25-year relationship. You want to grow with the family. You do not, I do not think, achieve this by walking in with the answers. That's why at SFO Research, we take such issue with the term best practice. The term best practice for me is not best. What we need to work towards is developing good practices with family. It creates a common meeting ground of co-design. And ultimately, what I'm saying sounds quite esoteric, but how does this play out practically? It's the difference between coming in with the predetermined policies and ways to regulate a family dynamics versus the deep learning that is required from working with a family. And that's how you can work together to help stimulate cooperation.
So you actually raise a good point, because one needs to be very careful to go in and dictate culture.
Yes.
The family has got to own it. And actually, the family needs to define it for themselves. They need to sit down, and of course we're cognizant that there are different family units that come into this, depending on the structure of the family, sure. G1, G2, whoever is involved. But they've got to co-craft it.
Exactly.
And that is where we would provide guidance in that process.
Exactly. But, it starts with simple steps. I was in a conversation with a family group a couple of weeks back, and we were talking about sort of putting together the new investment committee. And something interesting happened where it was almost pre-decided or predetermined who would form part of the investment committee. And ironically, how these things tend to work, it was the father, it was the eldest son who studied an MBA, it was the younger brother who had some interest in business. There were 3 or 4 other people represented in the room as part of this family meeting who are just, for no reason, just not to be part of that. And the conversation completely changed when we discussed, how this is a journey. You don't need to sit in the conversation right now and be able to add immediate value by explaining market analysis or reporting on last year and how it's going to influence next year. There's a catch-up period that's required, but there's almost a recognition that was stimulated in that very moment of it's okay to climb in at this point. I'm 43, I don't know anything about investments. That's okay. But join the conversation. Be part of the meeting. There's dignity in inclusion. And that could or could not, but maybe could, lead to organic interest and involvement. 18 months from now, you've got a newly identified active participant in a family who now forms part of the investment committee, but it's just through inclusion that is possible.
Absolutely. And it talks to giving each person a voice so they feel valued.
Yes.
And they feel like they are an integral part of that family.
Absolutely.
And remove that kind of approach and you start creating all sorts of other issues, right? And I'm not saying again that this is going to solve the world's problems, but it will go a very long way to creating that inclusivity and most importantly to creating harmony.
Ajanta, so often, and as you know, I'm quite fond of behavior.
Yes.
And trying to understand human behavior. And so often when I look at the patterns within families, it's not malicious, it's not wrong. It's just we sort of repeat what is familiar, right? So a lot of the times when I look sort of from a patriarch or matriarch perspective, and I look, for example, at perceived exclusion, it's not on purpose. It's almost like a safety behavior. I think there's almost a protection thing that happens, even though it might be seen as clumsy, where G1 does not want to, I almost want to say, overwhelm or expose Gs 2 or 3 who maybe do not have the financial proficiency. But it's not that it needs to be disrupted. It needs to be disrupted by people like us to at least ask the question to say, should we rethink their involvement? Should we not open that invitation? And you might just be surprised.
And, an immediate example comes to mind for me, right? Because we talk of generally a patriarch or the founder of a business wanting to retain that control and not letting anyone in,
yes.
right? Now, the drawback of that is something happens to that patriarch who's no longer sort of pulling the strings together, and that family can fall apart. That business can fall apart. The employees are also impacted, right? So this is a process. And to your note on inclusivity, we've got to start that process where everyone's got a voice, everyone understands and aligns on values. So, and we've all got examples in terms of a typical example that comes to mind, right? I've had a client, second generation, are 3 children who are very much part of an extremely successful business. Each couldn't be more different, right? The patriarch passes away and the business, a very thriving business, is now split, right? It's your typical story. But you understand how this works. The business is fragmented. The families are fragmented, right? So here lies a responsibility for us, as well as an opportunity.
But the kind of value add that you will bring by being able to understand the family's dynamics and ultimately to solution within the context of those dynamics. It's the difference between idealized design and hoping for the best, or truly adding value by creating bespoke solutions.
Exactly. And adding value with bespoke solutions can materialize in two ways, right? So it can be product, and as I've indicated, that can be solutioned. You can leverage the full capability of any organization, but really adding true value. And when we talk of wealth preservation, right, we're talking of preserving relationships, and being able to take that forth to the next generation.
Exactly. Ajanta, I think there's this focus, this over-focus when we talk about the intergenerational transfer of wealth, to merely focus on the financial capital component. And that's something that came out key in our discussion and at the convention this year. The greatest wealth transfer in history is not only about the capital component, it's about the family capital component. And by extension of that, it is about a transfer or a great transfer of a wealth of knowledge which exists within every family. And if you think about, if we just zoom out all the way, as I know you and I both like to do, if we say that everything has a future, everything has a life cycle, if you look at the typical entrepreneurial family, there's a tipping point where I almost want to say wealth creation objectives tip over into a responsibility or almost sometimes a panic to now fast-track wealth preservation objectives, or almost want to say a wealth preservation reality.
Right.
What does that mean practically? G1 built an extremely complex and incredible thriving business. It's statistically improbable that Gs 2 and 3 are going to take it over, or that they even subscribe to an additive culture. They're going to, at best, draw down from the portfolio. Now mom and dad are in their 70s. What happens now? So it purely changes from, I almost want to say, this responsibility of feeling that I have to create wealth to, oh dear, what now?
And that's an interesting one, right? So you talk of that disparity in terms of wanting to, or the second gen wanting to continue with that legacy or the business. But it goes down to simple things such as you've got mom and dad sitting around the dinner table, right? They have a huge or very successful business, and the intent is always that the children will take over the business, right? And there's no guarantee. But what we're also talking about is the kind of conversations that happen around the dinner table. So does mom and dad come home and complain, around business, or do they create a bit of hype around it? And of course, life carries on. It's not always going to be sunshine and roses. But I think the messaging to younger children is really important. If there is that intent to create the legacy, to equip them with the skills and resilience from a younger age to understand the adversity that exists, but how to traverse that, right? And there's a lot of family and institutional knowledge within the founders of the business that needs to be passed on to subsequent generations. And therein lies the success of family business, aside from the affinity. So it's those kind of things that need to be harnessed, and a framework needs to be built around that. In order to leverage this.
Absolutely. And Ajanta, I'm so glad that you got practical now, because we've aligned on the fact that this is so vast. It's so necessary, but it's so difficult to do. That's how the framework came into being. I'm very pleased to now share with our audience that our article is finally out. And one of the key focuses of our article was containing or understanding family governance as this Overwatch brief. For me, it's very important, and it was very important in our panel discussion, that family governance wasn't this moment. It's not like they said a lot of things which are very interesting, and this, from a GDP perspective, is super relevant, but what now? Right. What I am very proud about, and what we should both be very proud of, is the fact that anyone sitting in the audience this week could understand that family governance can almost be contained as having an Overwatch brief. And that's something that came out very clearly in our conversation. I think, and just circling back to the complexity of what was discussed, is understanding that family governance has always been necessary. It's just if we understand what is happening now in the context of the greatest wealth transfer in history, it's more a teachable moment than it is a moment in time. It's a real opportunity for anyone who sees work with families as an opportunity to upskill and to differentiate, to really take a tangible thing, this framework, bring it all together and understand how family governance actually has fit in wealth management practice. We see when you and I discuss often the role of family governance and how it influences every aspect of the wealth management mandate. It's not sort of this thing that exists on the side.
And it's certainly not something that you revisit once a year. It
Absolutely
is
not.
a dynamic process. And part of this process, it's constituted by individuals, right?
Absolutely.
So individuals that are part of a family unit that's part of a bigger family unit. So there are multiple moving parts. And I'm not even talking about all of the legal stuff because that comes into it, right? So the legal, the estate planning, the tax aspects, the profitability, the management, the strategy, all of that is part and parcel of this. So by no means are we saying that we're discounting any of that. We're also just saying that has been the critical focus area for a number of years, right? But what is it that we now need to do differently?
Exactly. And it sounds bold, but there is a paradigm shift. It's just paradigms will not shift themselves.
Right.
Wealth management professionals, financial services professionals, are instrumental in helping families shift. What is happening, if you just think about it practically, if we again just go sort of very wide, is if you asked any 12 people with different levels of sophistication and understanding to define wealth management, you'd probably get 24 different answers.
Right.
And many of those answers would be rooted in performance-driven definitions.
Spot on, yes.
But here's the thing. What we have ultimately aligned on in our B2B collaboration between SFO and Absa Private Wealth more so requires a working definition, a definition that works. And that's why I take immense comfort in the advice that, well, it's rooted in the advice that we are giving to families, and that we have identified 4 key principles as what ultimately shapes the wealth management mandate. Being able to sit back and understand wealth management consisting and substantiated by a first principles framework, which redefines the family office mandate as overwatch, continuity, performance, and conformance, is so much more conducive to what we're talking about than seeing wealth management as a performance-driven financial capital conversation.
There's so much more to it, but I like the way that you frame that because there's structure. And this is where we come in, right? Firstly, to create the awareness of need. Because sometimes families don't know what they don't know, right? And I see this a lot in practice where very successful business people just carry on doing what they're good at.
Exactly.
So that's to perpetuate the success of the business, and they do exceptionally well. But at what cost?
And it comes back to your question, what does success look like?
Right.
And if you had to ask me, from an SFO research perspective, what success looks like, I almost want to come back, and at the risk of oversimplification, to say that, not to discredit the very necessary performance conversation, but that's like a given. The portfolio must perform, it must perform adequately, here are the benchmarks. But it is a mere enabler. Success looks a lot like, if you speak to a client in their 70s or 80s, that I want my family to be happy. I want us as a group of people who do different things to be aligned somehow. Ultimately, I do not want dependence on the portfolio. I want my family to flourish. That's already a very, very different definition to let's grow 10% year on year and that equals success and wealth management tick box.
And those different aspects, when you bring it into the family environment, introduce the different personalities and the different dynamics, is where it gets interesting, right? So you can have 3 or 4, let's just say 4 children, defining harmony, flourishing, success completely differently. Put them together in a business and a family unit. And that's where support, guidance, and advice is needed.
Ajanta, as an advisor to families, if your starting position is from a family governance perspective, and if we talk about value add right now, quick win, if that's sort of the departure point, tangible, real next steps. If right now you are facilitating a conversation about goal alignment, if you are the person that holds that kind of space for a family, that can be instrumental in starting the conversation about goal alignment. Goals as they exist now might not be aligned, or they might just be, but the conversation's not happening.
Yes. And when we talk about goal alignment, we're not saying what investment returns do you want? What is your risk profile? Who do you want to leave as beneficiaries in your will? That's not it. I often like to ask families, what is important to you? What is important for your business? And asking each individual member that question yields different results. And Gerrit, this next step that we're embarking on within Absa Private Wealth is literally changing lives. It's impacting families. And this goes above and beyond just product and profitability.
Absolutely.
It's impacting lives.
It 100% is. And Ajanta, that for me is why, from an SFO perspective, we are so proud of the B2B collaboration with Absa Wealth, which we can now share publicly as official, but it's something that we framed as, it's a different B2B collaboration. It's not business to business. It really is boutique to bank.
Right.
And I think the value for me in this, not only in terms of not only from an offshore solutions perspective, is the fact that we are serious about the research. You talk about changing lives, and it's evident. The research work that we are using from a training perspective is already affecting that kind of change. And thinking beyond GDP, thinking about right here, right now, what we are able to do together to support families. The world, you cannot get away from this idea of purpose. There's absolute purpose in this.
Absolutely. We have purpose.
Sorry, did you say absolutely?
I may have. It's a habit.
Sorry, I had to. Oh, is it an actual thing?
I do use it from time to time. True story. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Ajanta, but it's not only for me about this very proud business-to-business collaboration between SFO and Absa, but also seeing the change that you are driving with family governance, the development of the Wealth Management First Principles framework, introducing a clear fit for family governance and wealth management practice. I think that this is an incredible moment, and one that I'm extremely proud to share publicly now for the first time. But it's wonderful to see what we are already doing together.
It is incredible, particularly when we look back on where we started on this journey to this point where we're able to move forward for our clients, but also just create awareness in industry.
Yes.
And around this concept where it's not just something that's light and fluffy,
No.
Where we're just talking about happy families, etc. There's deep substance, process, and you talk of a framework that underpins this entire thing.
Absolutely. So
Did you just do it?
Absolutely. Ajanta, thank you for coming on to the NightMarkets podcast this evening. I'm very pleased that we were able to continue this very necessary conversation that we started at the FPI convention this year. And I'm also really excited about our first paper together.
Yes.
Which is now going to be available with the infographic component to it, which really visualizes Overwatch, this very key function that we've been discussing, and its fit within the wealth management mandate.
Thank you, Gerrit. It's been such a pleasure being here. Also, just engaging on this market-leading topic. And I think together we're going to change lives and families and possibly impact the industry.
In fact, that's already started happening.
Indeed.
Thanks, Ajanta.